He clutched his chest, staring blankly at the pavement, trying to process the violent shift in reality. They scared me. His voice cracked, entirely stripped of its dignity. He slowly looked up, his watery, bloodshot eyes finally meeting Mike's dark gaze. "I'm not as strong as I used to be." Mike took a slow, deliberate step forward. He gently placed the salvaged groceries into Frank's one surviving plastic bag. Then, Mike reached out. His massive, calloused knuckles brushed lightly against the cheap beige fabric. He took firm hold of the thin lapels of Frank's insufficient windbreaker. He pulled the fabric tighter around the old man's shivering, frail shoulders, smoothing the collar up against the biting, unforgiving Manhattan wind. Their eyes met, a slow, deliberate nod. No thank you was necessary. The Manhattan night swallowed them back into its heavy, quiet darkness. He physically pulled the kid's sweating face forward, dragging him mere inches from the tribal tattoo. "You like hunting the weak?" His breath hot and terrifyingly calm against Brandon's frozen face. "Open your eyes. Look at me." Brandon couldn't breathe. He just stared into the abyss, his head shaking rapidly. The cheap nylon of his hoodie scraped frantically against the rough brick as his body vibrated with raw, unchecked panic. A few feet away, the bleach-blonde illusion of Kevin shattered just as violently. The evolutionary instinct to flee completely hijacked his central nervous system. Kevin and Malik stumbled backward, violently tangling in their own oversized feet, nearly crashing into the steel base of the street lamp. A dark, warm stain began to rapidly spread down the inner seam of Kevin's baggy denim jeans. The unmistakable scent of warm urine cut cleanly through the cold Manhattan air, a humiliating testament to their broken pride. Neither of them dared to speak a single word. Neither of them dared to take a full breath. They just stared, trembling violently from head to toe at the statue of living violence effortlessly pinning their leader to the wall. Mike held Brandon there for 3 more agonizing seconds, burning the raw, visceral fear permanently into the kid's DNA. Slowly, deliberately, Mike opened his thick fingers. Brandon immediately crumpled against the brick, sliding pathetically down the wall until his weak knees hit the concrete. He didn't try to stand back up. He just stayed there on the ground, a broken, gasping, shivering heap of ruined ego clutching his bruised chest. Mike didn't look down at him anymore. He turned his heavy, dead-eyed gaze toward the other 2 cowards, shivering near the curb, soaking in the absolute totality of their own terror. He didn't ask for an apology. He didn't ask if they had anything to say in their defense. He just delivered a single, crushing syllable that shattered whatever fake street pride they had left. "Leave." It was a roar compressed into a razor-sharp whisper. They didn't walk. They scrambled like blind roaches fleeing a sudden light. Giving Mike a wide, terrified berth, the wolves turned into frightened prey, practically tripping over each other as they scurried blindly into the deep shadows of the alley, absolutely desperate to put as much solid concrete between themselves and the heavyweight champion as humanly possible. Mike watched the darkness swallow them. Only then did the rigid tension slowly bleed out of his massive shoulders. He exhaled a long breath, the mist pluming in the cold, biting air, and turned his frame back toward the curb where the real damage had been done. The torn plastic grocery bag had finally surrendered entirely, spilling a crushed yellow cardboard box of crackers
and a few loose, dented cans onto the filthy, oil-stained asphalt. Mike Tyson, a man who had built a global empire and a terrifying legacy on breaking human bones, bent down, his heavy leather jacket creaking in the quiet night, and he gently gathered the crushed box and loose cans. Frank was still leaning heavily against the steel street sign. He was trembling violently, his frail chest heaving rapidly as the massive spike of adrenaline slowly crashed out of his system, leaving behind nothing but cold exhaustion. The arrogant sneer was still glued to his face, though it trembled slightly at the edges, the facade beginning to crack under the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. His sneakers scraped the gritty pavement, a harsh sound in the sudden, dead quiet. He puffed out his chest, throwing his shoulders back, expecting to see some off-duty bartender or loudmouth pedestrian trying to play neighborhood hero. Instead, he looked up and up. He saw a mountain blocking out the city lights. The amber streetlights carved harsh shadows across Mike's broad features, highlighting the sheer density of the man. There was no aggressive posturing, no raised voice, no clenched fists preparing for a street brawl. Just a cold, dead-eyed stillness that belonged exclusively to a creature accustomed to destroying other human beings for a living. "This doesn't concern you, man." But the sharp edge of his voice had suddenly dulled into a flat drone. The bravado was hollow, echoing with a faint tremor that violently betrayed his crashing heart rate. "Walk away." Mike didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just moved. A sharp, dry crack. No wind-up. Mike's giant hand clamped onto Brandon's collar. Before the kid's brain could even fire a signal to blink, his heels had already left the pavement. In one fluid, devastating motion, Mike drove him backward. Brandon's spine hit the freezing brick wall of the closed storefront with the unstoppable force of a locomotive. The impact knocked every molecule of oxygen from his lungs in a wet gasp. Mike's arm locked into place like a solid steel I-beam, pinning the boy to the masonry so hard the old mortar between the bricks groaned. They were face to face now, inches apart. In that claustrophobic proximity, the tough guy illusion shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Brandon stared up into the dark intensity of the eyes looking down at him. He saw the distinctive tribal ink curving aggressively around the left temple. He felt the immovable structural integrity of the massive arm pinning him against the wall, literally crushing his sternum inward, trapping his lungs against his ribcage. The arrogant sneer melted off his face. His pupils dilated until his eyes were pitch black. The cheap cologne radiating off his skin was instantly overpowered by the sharp, acidic stench of his own cold sweat. He had just threatened a helpless man in front of the baddest man on the planet. I'm sorry. We didn't." Mike's other hand came up, not to strike, but to slowly grab a thick fistful of Brandon's collar.
His steps widened, his pace accelerated with the silent, devastating grace of an apex predator locking on to a target. Marcus mirrored him perfectly, a lethal ghost, eyes darting down the block, scanning the dark rooftops, checking the pitch-black alley for a fourth or fifth hidden threat, calculating the angles of engagement. The old man, Frank, swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply against his wrinkled throat. His voice cracked, a desperate plea scraping its way up his dry windpipe. I'm a veteran. I served my country. Please, I just want to go home." Brandon chuckled darkly. He stepped entirely into the man's physical bubble, tapping his dirty, calloused fingers hard against the old man's frail chest. "Is that so? Then call the army to save you. Go on, call 'em. Do I look like a guy who gives a shit?" Mike was 15 feet away. He could see the milky film of age and defeat in the panicked eyes of Frank,
He could physically see the erratic pulse fluttering like a trapped moth in the old man's thin neck, the sheer physiological terror taking over the failing body. "I'm gonna count to 3. The arrogant mockery vanished entirely, replaced with blunt, naked malice. 1. Frank's hands jerked involuntarily. A cardboard box of crackers shifted heavily inside the thin plastic bag, stretching the cheap material to the absolute breaking point. 2. Frank dragged his foot back again. His heel hovered dangerously over the sharp 6-inch drop of the concrete curb. His balance was completely shot. Gravity was pulling at him. 3. Brandon's arms shot out. He slammed both palms violently into Frank's chest. A hollow thud echoed off the brick storefront. Frank's frail feet tangled over each other. The heavy grocery bag swung in a wild, uncontrollable arc. The strained plastic caught the rusted edge of a nearby city mailbox and tore wide open. A sharp ripping sound sliced right through the quiet Manhattan night. "Hey!" His voice broke into a high, pathetic register as he scrambled desperately for balance, his hands flailing to catch nothing but empty, freezing air. Brandon's face twisted into a hateful snarl. He lunged forward, planting his heavy boots, rearing his shoulders back to shove the old man a second time, fully intending to put the frail body flat on its back on the freezing pavement and strip him of whatever he had left. A massive shadow eclipsed the amber street lamp. "That's enough." The syllables swallowed the violence whole. The voice didn't yell. It didn't need to raise a single decibel. It rumbled up from the pavement itself, deep, resonant, and absolute authority. It was a frequency that froze the blood in Brandon's veins and made the very concrete beneath their feet hold its breath. Brandon pivoted slowly. An old man, his sparse white hair plastered to his skull by a sudden sheen of cold sweat, was caught in the harsh amber glow of a street lamp. He wore a thin, cheap beige windbreaker that hung entirely too loose on his frail frame. He was shaking with every erratic, shallow breath his lungs fought to pull in. His knuckles were bone white, gripped in a desperate deathlock around the handles of 2 translucent plastic grocery bags. The thin plastic crinkled in the quiet street. Crack, rustle. Crack, rustle. It was the loudest sound on the block. The man was vibrating out of his worn shoes, his knees knocking together under the baggy fabric of his slacks. He took an agonizing step backward. His worn leather loafer scraped against the gritty, glass-strewn concrete. The heel caught slightly on the jagged edge of the curb. One more step, and he would tumble backward into the filthy gutter. He was the prey. The wolves had already formed their circle. 3 of them. They carried the restless, hot-o energy of young men fueled by cheap street adrenaline and the cowardly arrogance of outnumbering a much weaker animal. Baggy denim and oversized hoodies swallowed their unearned swagger. They were projecting a violent menace they hadn't actually bled for, playing a dangerous game on a sidewalk that didn't belong to them. The alpha of the pack, a white kid in his mid-20s with a severe, uneven buzz cut and an ugly sneer, stepped forward. His name was Brandon. The street lamp caught the hard, artificial glint in his dilated pupils. He swaggered, rolling his narrow shoulders, aggressively invading the old man's rapidly shrinking personal space. The nauseating scent of stale sweat and cheap aerosol cologne hung like an invisible cloud in the freezing air between them. Brandon tilted his chin down, his dead eyes locking onto the trembling plastic bags. He reached out, a dirty fingernail tapping the strained nylon. Brandon spat. The thick phlegm narrowly missed the toe of the old man's worn loafer, splattering on the pavement. "Hand over the bag, or wait for me to snap your fingers off one by one to get it." To the right, a second figure shifted his weight, his sneakers grinding against the asphalt. Kevin, bleach-blonde hair glowing under the sodium lights like a dirty halo. He dragged the thick sole of his shoe across the pavement. casually stepping off the curb to fully block the narrow alleyway escape route. He flashed a cold smile of jagged teeth, silently feeding off the old man's torment. From the deeper, ink-black shadows on the left, Malik, wrapped in a heavy New York Knicks hoodie, let out a low, scraping laugh. It was the exact sound of hyenas closing the perimeter, circling the wounded, waiting for the first bite. Mike's massive jaw clenched, the dense muscles beneath his leather jacket coiled tight, heavy as steel elevator cables, snapping taut under immense strain. He didn't run. He just changed his trajectory.
Manhattan exhales a distinctly bitter breath in the early evening. The frantic heat of the dinner rush burned off hours ago, leaving a hollow, heavy quiet over the concrete. It was the mid-2000s, an era when the avenue still held a lingering edge, a raw current running beneath the pavement. The air smelled of cooling asphalt, distant diesel exhaust from grinding city buses, and the metallic tang of a coming rain that had yet to wash the oily grime from the subway grates. Streetlights flickered to life with a low, erratic electrical hum, casting long amber pools across the damp, uneven pavement. The city was settling into its nocturnal rhythm. Predators were waking up. They were stretching their legs. Heavy leather boots struck the sidewalk in a steady, metronomic rhythm. Each footfall was a deliberate claim of territory, sending faint vibrations through the souls of anyone standing too close. Mike Tyson was just a man walking off a good steak. In his late 30s, the raw violence of his youth, the kind of feral, unchained devastation that had made him the most feared creature walking the earth, had calcified into a quiet, simmering density. He didn't walk so much as he displaced the physical air around him, moving with the heavy, inevitable momentum of a glacier grinding over stone. He wore dark, stiff denim and a thick leather jacket that swallowed the city's scattered neon glare without reflecting a single beam of light. Beside him walked Marcus, a shadow wrapped in a tailored black overcoat. Marcus didn't just walk, he glided over the concrete without making a sound. His eyes constantly tracked the micro-movements of the street, reading the hidden language of the alleys, the shifting postures of strangers. His shoulder hovered exactly 2 feet from Mike's, close enough to intercept a swung blade, far enough to let a living legend breathe the cold air. They were 4 blocks from where the armored SUV was parked in a secure garage. The world was nothing but the rhythmic scuff-tap of their shoes, the buzzing hum of neon signs bleeding dull red into closed storefronts, and the biting chill of the wind creeping down the concrete canyons. Then the rhythm broke. "Please, I don't want any trouble." It wasn't a shout. It was a fracture in the cold air. The voice was a thin, metallic squeak, the sound of vocal cords tightening under pure terror. The ambient noise of the street seemed to die instantly, leaving only the chilling resonance of that single, desperate plea hanging in the biting wind. Mike's heavy boot hovered for a fraction of a second before meeting the pavement. He didn't jerk his head around. He just stopped. The air around him grew violently still, the atmospheric pressure dropping like a stone. Marcus froze instantly, a coiled spring. His right hand drifted, slow, smooth, and utterly lethal toward the inner breast lining of his coat, where his phone and his cold steel rested, waiting for the silent signal. 20 feet ahead, half swallowed by the bruised shadow of a pulled-down corrugated metal security grate, the scene unfolded in agonizing slow motion.